Okay, cool. That works.
Sounds good. So the talk will be recorded, so if anyone is not really super comfortable with it, then you can like turn off the camera, turn off the microphone and everything. And also I can like read the comments also, like the chat in the Zoom. So feel free to leave questions whenever it's like anything comes up. So yeah. Yeah, should I start, Marianne?
Yeah, I just want to thank you so much for joining us. I think many people know Guangyi. He's a PhD student at the University of Texas in Austin, but he has been joining our reading group every once in a while, even at somewhat ridiculous times for him. Like right now, we're actually in this weird time zone limbo where we have 1 hour less of a difference. So of course we take advantage of that. And also he happens to have two new very exciting papers out, and that's what he will present today. Yeah, thanks also for all of the new people who joined by Guangxi's invite. Very excited to have so many people join. We actually meet every month. Um,
Mhm.
so if you would like to be on the general mailing list, just send me an email and I can add you. But yeah, for now, let's listen to Guangxi.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm Kwang Yi. I was with Cindy and David Morrison back at CMU as a master's student. Now I moved to UT Austin with David Harwath. And today I'm going to talk about the bold claim that self-supervised speech models are actually phonological vector machines. So I'm going to present two papers, one already submitted to ACL, the other submitted to Interspeech. We're waiting for the results to come out. So those two papers are very, like, what do you call it, sister papers, I'd say. So the first paper is claiming that a single phone is actually within the self-supervised representations, it's represented by linear combination of phonological vectors. And the second paper would be expanding that argument to sequence of phones. And sequence of phones are represented by linear combination of phonological subspaces, which are like apparently orthogonal with each other. So let's get started. So first paper, basically the author lists are the same. Like me, Eunjung is a postdoc at UT. Charchun is a doc, like PhD at Berkeley, and David at UT, David at CMU. So yeah, before we get started, let's briefly go over what self-supervised speech models are. We are starting with a bunch of unlabeled audio. We're basically masking random portions of it and passing through the transformer and trying to predict that masked portion from the neighboring signals. So that's how we train these self-supervised speech models, and that's why we call it self-supervised because it doesn't really require any labels, it only requires the raw speech data. So we call them self-supervised speech models or S3Ms, like SSMs. So, and also we'll also have to know what is phonological features. So phone is basically any speech sound produced by the human vocal tract. So basically part of speech. And like phone and phoneme is slightly different. Phoneme is more like a unit of sound that it can be made meaningful distinctions in a specific language, but phone is more like language universal. So phone is arguably continuous and phoneme is discrete. But we do use the International Phonetic Alphabet to transcribe, which implicitly categorizes sounds. So like there's that, like there are some subtleties inside it, but anyways. And also, um, we call phonological features are basically properties that's basically used to describe speech sounds. So, for example, if we compare between b and p, those two differences comes from voicing. In other words, whether vocal cord vibrates or not. So basically, you can like do this and like b and p, like you can feel the vibration on the b sound, but not on the p sound. And also, we are basically primarily using Pantone features for the phonological features. There can be multiple systems, but we are primarily using Pantone side. So basically, it's 24 of these kind of voicing or like high, low, roundness, whatever, and those are plus one or zero or minus one. So for example, Buffon is a like voiced bilabial stop, and voiced meaning vocal cords are vibrating during articulation, and bilabial meaning you're using the lips to like construct the sounds, like b, p, m, those are all bilabial sounds. And stop is basically vocal tract is blocked so that all airflow ceases. So like bdg, ptk, those are like the English stops, so to speak. And using these phonological features, we can actually define phonological analogies. So I think this word analogy like figure is pretty famous. So we're using this as a way to understand this. So phonological analogies are basically analogous to word analogies. So for example, if we start by p, we can either do like directly apply voicing to get to b, or we can do an inverse of bilabial and then voicing and then do bilabial again to get b, such that it can be like p minus t plus d maybe leads to boot or not. So these are the linguistically defined phonological analogies, and basically we want to check whether this is working in the self-supervised representations or not. So basically there like for the first paper, there's like two things that we are going to do. The first thing is whether these kind of analogies work in the self-supervised representations. And the second experiment would be so basically, this analogy implies that there are some sort of voicing vector. And what we are going to do is whether this voicing vector actually works or not. So we're basically extracting this voicing vector and applying to, for example, in the utterance of pet, we are only adding this voicing vector extracted from these analogies to that specific position. And reconstruct or resynthesize the audio and basically listen to the edited speech, so to speak. So basically, we are going to do two experiments. One experiment would be observing in a representation side, and the second will be observing on the speech side or the input side. So to do the first experiment, we basically have to do automatic generations of phonological analogies. And luckily, we have a couple of data sets. We have Timmit and Los Angeles. Those are basically time aligned, or in other words, we have start time, start second, and end second for each individual phonetic transcriptions or phones. So for Timmit, it's a sentence level data set. Los Angeles is more like a word level. Timmit only has English. Los Angeles has much more wider like language varieties, so much more wider phonetic varieties, but with smaller data size. So we're testing 19 phonological features from Panphon, and basically we can't like using Panphon, basically we can come up with these kind of symmetric analogies because Panphon is basically like a vector of -1 or 0 or +1, right? So what we can basically do is we can try to find whether the Panphon vectors b minus p is exactly equal to d minus 2. And there are some actual subtleties when like calculating these vectors, but I'm just skipping that for now. But anyways, if we think about these kind of analogies, there can be two symmetric analogies. One will be like if we recall, there was a blue arrow and a like pink arrow, right? So the blue arrow would be the voicing side. The pink arrow would be the place of articulation. So there are actually two symmetric analogies, but in the end, their self-supervised representation counterpart becomes basically the same because it's basically swapping the position of the input, and that's it. So basically, what we are checking is whether like this equivalence holds or not. So we are basically constructing these kind of like symmetric analogies again by using Panphon and basically checking whether these Panphon features are the difference of Panphon features are exact. And we end up with a couple of hundreds of like phone quadruplets that we call. And let's start with experiment one. So what we are asking is whether like the representations of P1 and P2 plus P3 minus P4 is around the same, right? So that's what we want to observe. And we can't really observe only using this. wait. Like we are basically looking at the average cosine similarities, and we have basically two baselines, the upper and the lower baseline. The upper baseline would be basically cosine similarities between the same phone, and lower would be similarities between different phones. And we define a so-called success rate, and we're basically looking at the proportion of quadruplets whose similarity scores satisfies this ordering of like lower baseline being like smaller than that like average cosine similarities of phonological analogies, and that in between like lower and upper baseline. And like there were like about a couple of hundred quadruplets, right? Like we are going to check whether for individual quadruplets, we're checking whether these inequality holds, and we will label them like one or zero, such that like for example, if there are like 200 analogies, we're checking how much analogies are actually successful. So we call that a successful, like success rate metric or something like such that it yields like 90, like if it yields 90%, then 180 of them, like, it's basically satisfying this ordering. So we are observing three self-supervised models, Waveland, Wave2Vec2, and Hubert. Those are all monolingual models, meaning the underlying data set is English only. And here the x-axis is the layer index, y-axis is the success rate. And we're like these dotted lines are basically the spectral baselines like MCCs and log-mels. And obviously we can like see, not surprisingly, that self-supervised representations are often better than spectral representations on specific layers. And also, if we compare layer zero with everything else, it's often the case that greater number of analogies starts to hold for the middle or final layers. This implies the contextualization, which, like, thanks to the intermediate layers of transformers, where we will discuss this on the next paper in much more detail. And also, it seems that like self-supervised representations generalize to unseen phones also because the upper three figures are from Timid, the lower three figures are from Vox Angeles. The former pretty much similar. And Vox Angeles has lots of phones that doesn't exist in the English like phoneme set or allophones or whatever. And it still holds such analogies, which implies a cross-linguality of these monolingual representations. Um, and let's go over in detail. We're looking at now consonant-based analogies and vowel-based analogies. And apparently there are some different layer-wise behaviors between consonants and vowels, which is pretty interesting because vowels and consonants tend to be like differently structured, meaning vowel cues are temporally like localized, so to speak, but consonantal cues are much more like complex. Like for example, for Boo, there are like a burst, there are a silence, there are like whatever. So like such that like segment is like somewhat like often distributed. So apparently those are actually influencing these kind of performances. But so yeah, apparently that's that. There's that. And based on these results, let's go over a little bit more interesting one, like which is actually observing like the edited speech or editing the speech based on like these kind of like phonological vectors. So we are basically defining this phonological vector by like the difference between the mean representations of phones with and without the feature I. Meaning, for example, let's consider the voicing vector, like this blue vector. Um, what we're doing is basically we're um the first is basically all the utterances, all the phones that had voicing, and all the utterances or phones like that didn't have voicing, and basically we subtracted it. Um, and by ex like based on this like extracted VI, where I is basically like voicing or high, low, whatever, we are basically doing editing on the representations. Basically, it's very simple. Like we're basically adding this vector to that specific position, like to that specific frame, and that's it. And we are basically controlling the weight of this vector as lambda. So we will be testing various lambdas, but yeah. Um, and oh yeah, and we also have had to come up with a way of inverting the representation, meaning in the figure, like we have to model the F inverse or F minus one, right? So to do this, basically we trained the vocoder, which like there are plenty of vocoders, but we chose the ones that are known to be somewhat robust to these kind of out of distributions inputs. And what this vocoder basically does is vocoder is basically input is like representation and output is speech. So it's basically doing an invert. So keep in mind that these kind of analysis will be influenced by the vocoder quality and like vocoder influence also. But like given that like so there are some like pros and cons between experiment one and experiment two. One is like looking at the representations, but we are only looking at that pointwise representations because the input is fixed, right? And on the other hand, we're looking at the like so-called continuous like manifold of representations for experiment two. But even though we are bounded by the vocoder quality, so those two are pros and cons. So um, basically, for example, for figure five, what we are doing is like lambda zero is the case where like we didn't apply like any vector like additions. And this is basically applying a round vector to the front vowel. Note that like there is no round front vector in English, but these are all trained in English. It's like so vocoder is trained on LibreSpeech, I mean LibreTTS, I mean, and these are all self-supervised representations, right? But it ends up like generalizing. So if we look at the formants, like so orange and blue like arrows are basically um like F2 and F3. And a clear indicator for roundness is basically those formats are compressed. And we can see that like these formats are being compressed as the lambda increases or like the vector is increasing. I'm not sure if this will sound right, but
Chi,
like so it's part of the chi, so E sound. And if we start up
chi, chi, chi,
so like if you do like push the representation too much, it starts to get weird. But at least within the some sort of boundary, it tends to do like sound of kind of sound, which does not exist in English, but it generalizes anyways. And this is also an interesting one. Like this one is applying a nasal vector to the bone B. So like applying nasal to B should be like move to B to M. So that's and we can actually see that, for example, like the burst is like reduced, which implies that this vector is not only controlling the like in a spectral way, but in a temporal way also. And also we can see that these kind of voicing or the murmur, like I would say murmur, not voicing. This kind of murmur is like being like constantly increased. So if we can listen,
speak,
it's us B, but
speak, speak, speak,
yeah, it becomes a SME, right? Oh, if we listen to it again.
speak,
Yeah. So apparently nasality can be also like somewhat modeled using this representations. And also let's get the other ones also. Um, so we are basically applying the voicing vector to B. So this one is a little bit harder to listen. But so here, this one, like this, like if we look at lambda zero, oops, lambda zero, this like what do you call it? Thick line is basically the voicing vector. I mean the voicing bar. And if we remove the voicing vector, like it's this voicing bar is removed and removed. So
speak,
like it's the same example. Sp, it becomes
speak, speak, speak,
it becomes
speak,
sp, right? Like because like it's a little bit harder to listen, but we can clearly see in the spectrograms. And finally, we can apply the strident vector, which is like a stridency is like basically like f or something like that. So we are expecting the higher energy on 4 to 8 kilohertz ish, and we can actually observe that like energy is
speed,
become increasing?
speed, speed, speed,
Like in the end, like it becomes like basically removing all the burst and like just filling everything with a 4 to 8 kilohertz like noise. So yeah, and burst is also removed. So there's that. And as we've seen some qualitative examples. Let's look at this in quantitative way also. So what we've did is basically here, the lambda is the x-axis and y-axis is the acoustic correlates or acoustic measurements. So for example, for high, we are expecting the first formant to decrease and low first formant to increase. And like similarly, for voicing, we are expecting the voicing bar to increase, which indirectly decreases COG. That's what it means by F1 minus, like high F1 minus, like voice, like COG minus, like that's what it means. And lambda is basically from -5 to 5. And we're looking at the delta, meaning like the change of F1 or change of COG or something like that. And we can like clearly see that there are clear correlations between like the lambda side, like the weight and the y-axis here, like the acoustic correlates. So we can also observe in a quantitative way that these kind of phonological vectors also kind of works. So there's that, and that's the first paper. Let's go over the second paper. So the first paper was on like looking at individual phones, right? To recap, basically individual phones are like basically linearly represented. And what it means like by linear here is that phonological vectors are linear, so to speak, meaning that we can basically add or subtract and we can like apply like scalar weight lambda on top of it and it should work. So basically we've shown that these kind of phones that are basically living on the phonological space, right? Low dimensional phonological manifold, but yeah. But now we are now interested whether these kind of like whether this also holds not only for phones but also for sequence of phones. That's why we call it um, encode phonetic context by like position dependent. Like the latter part will make sense later on. So our goal is basically looking at like the phone information, a single phone across like average pooling. Um, Now we are basically aiming to understand how self-supervised representations contextualize. So like I briefly mentioned contextualize before, right? Like we are defining here the contextualize as encoding phonetic context or encoding sequence of phones. And we are curious how these self-supervised representations are encoding this. Like for example, like yeah, like there's that, like that's what we are currently looking at. And our hypothesis for this paper is this. So, first of all, we're looking at each frame level representation. So, like this pink thing, like we're only like not doing average pooling or whatever, like bells and whistles. We are looking at that singular frame representation, and we are focusing on how that singular frame encodes the sound. And we are not only looking at a single phone, but also a sequence of phones. So here, like the word is catch. So there are three phones, like k and ch. And we are claiming, or we hypothesized that this would be basically linear combinations, or like basically there will be an a vector, k vector, and ch vector, and basically a summation of those. That's what we hypothesized. And finally, yeah, like via linear combinations. And we also hypothesized that for example, these like here -1 0 +1 is the position. So -1 like relative position. So like this frame came from the A side. So like we call it A like the zero phone. And k to be -1 phone and ch to be +1 phone. So what we're claiming by corresponding to relative positions is that V k of like 0 and V k -1 would be different. Actually, they are orthogonal with each other, but like we'll see it soon. And we claim that because we like to encode a phone sequence, we need to encode like ordering, right? So that's why we are claiming that like these will like correspond to relative positions. And actually, empirically, we can also extract these kind of representations. So like left one is the spectrogram, right one is basically the positional phonological vectors we extracted. So this cur is basically the one that we've already seen in the previous paper, right? So for the cur, like this is a low vowel. So like the cur, like for this like air position is activated. And the strident, like ch is a strident. So the strident position is somewhat activated. But here, the interesting part is the prev and the next vectors. Prev means like, for example, let's look at the low prev. Um, you can see that the ch side is activated for the low prev, which means that in the ch phone's perspective, my previous phone is a low vowel. That's why that part is activated. So similarly, if we look at the lows next row, um, in the perspective of k, my next phone is a low vowel. So that's why like these part is activated. Similarly, for strident, we can also see this like staircase-like structure. So for in the perspective of A, my next phone or the plus one is like strident. So that's why this is activated. So we can see these kind of like staircase structure, but like let's go over this in detail. This is more like teaser thing. So we're like based on that hypothesis, we're basically doing four predictions in this paper. First is that like we are claiming there will be frame level compositionality, meaning like we previously seen that we can do phonological arithmetic and like the average pooled representations, but we're claiming that the same thing will happen for individual frames also. Like this will be a preliminary for all the other predictions. So the second and onwards, we're basically using only a singular frame. But the first one is that, I mean, the second prediction that we are going to do with this singular frame is that these vectors are contextualized, meaning these vectors will contain phonological information in neighboring phones. And also, furthermore, I briefly mentioned this, but we are hypothesizing that these phonological vectors will be orthogonal because if we think about it, for example, if neighboring phones like if first phone like zeroth phone is voiced and plus one phone is unvoiced, and if the voicing vector is the same for zero and plus one, then it will be very uh, confusing so-called for the model to say that, oh, like I am voiced or next one is voiced. Like this is impossible to distinguish if the voicing vector is exactly the same. We're claiming that the model has to make these orthogonal such that the model knows whether I am voiced or next one is voiced or previous one is voiced or something like that. And finally, this implies like phonetic segmentation, like meaning that like zeros, like if there are zeroth phones phonological subspaces and plus ones phonological subspaces and stuff like that, um, by basically looking at how subspaces change, we will be able to extract those phonological segmentations. Like we've already seen in the like previous example that there are some sort of subtle cues or like weak signals that that can actually segment, right? We want to like empirically also check that whether this segmentation is actually working or not. So that's the final prediction. In other words, to know whether next phone is voiced or current or previous phone is voiced, we like the model has to know the start and end time of individual phones. So that's the prediction of the hypothesis. So hopefully these four predictions are clear to everyone. So let's go over the first prediction first. So basically the setting is the same with the previous paper. But the only difference is that we're ditching mean polling and only using the center polling. So center polling is what center polling is basically so individual phone will have multiple frames, like for example, like 10 frames or something. Like we are basically choosing the like middle frame, like fifth frame or something like that, and using that representation. So we're basically looking at the same figure from previous slides, but the dotted one it was the same figure, and the bold one is the center polling. And basically, those two are very similar with each other. Even better, meaning that like these kind of analogies also like will hold for all like a singular representation, like these kind of phonological analogies. I mean, like again, the y-axis is the success rate, x-axis is the like layer. So yeah, so this was an easy one, but other ones a little bit more complex. So we want to check whether these contextualize. So let's consider a sequence of phones, -2, -1, 0, +1, +2. Um, and for this analysis, we're only always using the center frame or center pooling for P0. And what we're checking or measuring is whether phonological analogies also hold for neighboring phones also. What I mean by this is like we are basically comparing these four, like pet, pet, and that and bat. And we're like verifying whether this like analogy or this arithmetic works and by only using the center frame representation of A. But by the way, like I made the environments to be the same for easy understanding, but actually these environments might differ. The only thing would be this like consistent would be put to do and like add and to maybe like jumbled around, like shuffled around or whatever. So this is the result. So basically the zeroth one was the like already seen that like the previous figure is basically like merged into a single figure. And here's interesting is that the last layer, especially actually showing non-zero success rates, like for like -1 positions and +1 positions. So this naturally leads us to thinking that like then how where does these kind of phonological vectors like exist, right? So we are extending this experiment by doing random polling. So like previously, we've only seen that singular frame, like only single frame of like that center frame of that center phone, right? So what we are doing is basically using any frame of between -2 to +2. And we are basically measuring whether analogies hold like for P0. For example, like let's consider plant. So we verify whether analogies for a will hold throughout the full word, like full representation, regardless of positions. So like, yeah. So it's basically analogous to the previous experiment. So previous experiment is basically fixing the representation position and varying the phones. Here, we're basically fixing the center phone, but varying the like representation positions. So those two are the only differences. And we're looking at only at the like the best layer of the previous layer-wise like analysis. We are looking at WaveLM, Hubert, and Wave2Back2, same as before. For WaveLM and Hubert, it's like 24th layer. And x-axis here is basically zeros would be like within phone boundaries. So, and -1 +1 would be like neighboring phone. Like those are basically bound like normalized boundaries because phone like length will be different, but like we'll have to visualize somehow, right? So like we basically normalize the positions and bend it. And basically, the interesting part is that WaveLM especially is showing the trapezoidal pattern, meaning basically the like success rate is basically near constant within the phonetic boundary. But as you like move farther and farther apart, like success rates gradually decreases. And it seems that they are following a pattern based on the phonetic like boundaries. We will like test that on prediction 4. And yeah, like And this was why like we were seeing like non-zero performances because apparently success rates like smoothly degrades per the fun like as it goes farther and farther apart. So that was why. So now we will be, as we've shown in at least 24 layers of Wavelength or Hubert or whatever, as is showing that phonological vectors somehow exist for -1 and +1 positions also, we are now looking at positional orthogonality, like where I mentioned before that like there should be difference, like orthogonal or at least different between V0A and V-1A and V+1A, right? Something like that. So recall that like we extracted phonological vectors like this. Um, we are basically doing like it's basically exact same definition with the previous paper, but with an extended definition. So the first line of equation will be the same thing. Like so basically we're checking whether P0 like using all the representations that's like P0 is voiced case, like averaging it, and P0 is unvoiced and averaging it, and basically doing a mean like difference of means. And the one difference here is that we're also doing the same thing, but for P-1 and P+1, P-2, P+2 also. So we're basically looking at P-2 to P+2 again and again, over and over again, and basically using the center pool, like center representation of P0 over and over again, right? But we're averaging the case where P-1 is voiced and P-1 is non-voiced and like doing the subtractions. So that's how we're extracting the phonological vectors in terms of relative positions also. And basically, let's observe the easier one first, the cosine similarities between the P0 positions. Like basically, we are looking at 8 phonological vectors for the sake of visualization. Um, these 8 vectors are the ones that we've seen previously in the scatter plots and like the spectrograms and everything. So if like so basically this is a cosine similarity matrix. So for example, like this like low and high -0.79 is basically cosine similarity between low vector and high vector. And actually this is basically aligning with linguistic intuition because opposing features such as low and high is basically showing like opposite directions, right? And related features such as like nasal sonorant and voicing is basically showing like positive similarities, and voicing and consonantal features are basically orthogonal, partly because that's how we extracted it. Like I'll just skip this, but like ask me whenever. Um, so this one is basically showing the structure, the phonological, indirectly showing the phonological structure of P0. And now we are like, so this is basically looking at the phonological vectors based on P0. But now we will see the cosine similarities between positional phonological vectors, like vectors extracted by like fixing P-1 or P-2 or whatever. And so this is the positions -1, like -2, -1, 0, 1, 2. Those are positions. And we can like first see that different relative positions. So for example, -2 and -1, or -2 and 0, or whatever, is exhibiting substantially lower similarities. It's like around zero-ish, like actually -2 to 2. Like actually, if you actually plot the like density, it's like averaging on 0 and like kind of smoothish distribution on like around -1, -0.1 to +0 or -1, like something like that. But anyways, it's basically around 0. And furthermore, the relative similarity structure, like I also added the P0 figure above, it's basically copied over and over and over for -2 to +2, which is pretty interesting, right? Because it seems that the positional structure seems to extend beyond immediate neighbors, unlike we've seen previously for experiment 2. So that motivates us to only show the phonological vectors for +, -1, but experiment 3 is also showing +, -2. So we basically looked at the norm of the phonological vectors. So basically looking at like actually literally the norm of the like P0's voicing or P minus one's voicing or something like that in a layer-wise manner. So x-axis here is the layer, y-axis is the basically L2 norm, and like zero's vector is basically the blue line, and orange is +1, -1, like gray is +2, -2. We can clearly see that like the zeros, like phonological vectors, norm is the biggest, followed by +-1, +-2, and +-1 and +-2 are basically similar with each other. Um, and note that though we define the success rate as this. We're when we were doing averaging, we were only doing the sample-wise arithmetic. So basically, when we do this, we're randomly sampling any utterance from P1, like any like B or something. And then P2, P3, P4, we are doing the same and then averaging it. And like basically if we look at here, like it will be dominated by the biggest norm. So that's why like there were like strict decreases for -1 and plus like after -1 and +1 for experiment 2. But apparently, this is actually because of the difference of the norms. That's why it is happening, and that's why it's, in my opinion, it's more likely that there are position vectors like beyond like the immediate neighbors, likely beyond like -2 or +2. So finally, let's go over the phonetic segmentation side. Like recall the phonological vectors are calculated like this. And again, um, let's go over the v-1 voicing. So like basically we are extracting the vectors from P0, right? And we're fixing whether P-1 is voiced or unvoiced, right? So in the perspective of center frame, it's basically modifying the previous phone, right? So let's basically the cosine similarity between each frame and vector is that like for the first vector, the voicing vector, this one is easy. It's basically the so-called evidence of the current phone being voiced, but this one is slightly complicated. So again, we are looking at the representations on the center frame, and we are looking at like we're fixing whether my previous phone is voiced or unvoiced, right? So actually, this is basically evidence of my previous phone being voiced or not. So here, like that's why like this prev, like this one is basically the evidence of previous point being voiced. So that's why like this prev like row is calculated using the cosine v void -1. And yeah. And basically we can extend this to the full utterance. And it's super interesting because there are like clear staircase-like patterns especially extending upon -2 and +2 also. So like for example, if we look at the low side, like there are like clear staircases of like -2 and +2 actually with respect to the phonetic boundaries. So what we can do, like not only looking at this singular example, but what we can do is basically average all these kind of cosine similarities like by boundary onsets and offsets. So for example, for low, like this like start boundary, like start of the phone, like is it like A or something, is would be the boundary onset and end of the phone A would be boundary offset. And basically we are doing the cosine, like average of the all the cosine similarity changes. And basically we're looking at comparing the two evidences again, like we've like compare like v0 and like v-1's cosine similarities, right? That's what we are currently doing here. So we're like so for like the first column, it will be a phone, I mean boundary onset, and the second column will be boundary offset. And same for like boundary onset, offset, onset, offset for different phonological features. It's like high, low background, and nasal sonorants, strident, and voicing. So for example, if we look at the like leftmost upmost figure is basically high minus to high plus, meaning we're looking at the cosine similarities on the boundaries when like there was no high, like minus high to plus high or something like that. And the x-axis here is the frame index. It's not normalized. So it's basically 5 is the self-supervised representation's frame where the edge exists. And minus 4 would be, I mean, 4 would be one frame before. 3 would be one frame, like 2 frame before, and stuff like that. So we're basically looking at 11 frames from 0 to 10 and using 5 as the center. So if we look at here, like we can clearly see that like um, on around 5 at least, there seems to be clear transitions of uh, like the evidences, so to speak. And I previously mentioned that those spaces are orthogonal, right? So there are like, and apparently they are not only orthogonal, but they are constructed with respect to the phonetic boundaries, even though, again, recall that self-supervised representations are trained only with speech and no supervision, whatever. But it ends up modeling these kind of stuff implicitly. So let's recall our hypothesis. We hypothesized that each frame level representations, the frame level representations encode not only a single phone, but a sequence of phones, and via linear combination of phonological vectors, which are orthogonal with each other, corresponding to their relative positions, right? And we made 4 predictions. We showed the frame level like compositionality using like comparing the average pooling and center pooling. We've like shown contextualization of a single phone by looking at the success rates based on the previous phones or next phones. And we've looked at positional orthogonality by comparing the phonological vectors, like cosine similarities, those cosine similarity matrices. And finally, we've looked at the phonetic segmentation by looking at the average of like cosine changes. So then a natural follow-up question would be why should these kind of models encode in such a way? But like this paper is not really claiming to like have a really good explanation on that. Like that's, I think, still a very open question. But our current guess is that it comes from a mask filling behavior. So what we can do is we can observe a layer-wise cosine similarity between the original representation and the mask representations. And for all the layers, like especially for Hubert and Wavelem, cosine similarity is improving and improving and improving, right? Which implies that all layers of Hubert and Wavelem is basically largely driven to do better mask filling. And like this makes kind of sense, right? Because that's the only loss that we are observing. And uh like hypothesis is that um basically to predict, like they have to encode information useful for past and future predictions. And because like it's basically looking at the neighbors, like to reconstruct this. And if the neighbors already contain information on the center phone, then it'll be much more easier to predict, right? And second hypothesis is that it has to encode it because of the co-articulation effects, meaning neighboring phones or phonetic environments will influence the center phone's sound. And to accurately estimate the center phone, it has to encode like neighboring signals. But those are hypotheses, these are open questions. At least these are our current guesses. So let's see how it goes. Actually, we're pushing some paper, like pushing research on this also. So before going into that, let's go over like connections with the previous observations. So there has been observations that self-supervised tokens are somewhat phonetic tokens, right? And like there were some observations that those phonetic tokens or representations are clustering in terms of natural classes, like vowels and consonants are that like separate with each other, whether like within vowels they are more clustered-ish compared to comparing vowels and consonants and stuff like that. And why would monolingual self-supervised representations, for example, WaveLM, works well for multilingual ASR and stuff like that. And we're expecting this because these representations are storing phonetic information in terms of phonological vectors, which are arguably like cross-lingual. And these kind of, because of these kind of phonological vectors, basically these models are doing, like when we are doing cosine similarities, these models are kind of doing PFER type of thing. And people are calling those tokens to be semantic, so to speak, which is a bad idea, by the way. And also, why do those kind of representations encode like per allophones? For example, if we cluster A only, then if you look at subclusters, those are clustered by uh, like surrounding like phonetic environments. And also like there are some syllabic boundaries like extracted by Silber or syllable LM or stuff like Silber V2 or something like that. And apparently these were due to orthogonal positional subspaces. And what we are actually currently working on would be like some mathematical foundations of like these training and why should they like extending upon like our previous hypothesis on why should they encode phonological vectors and why should they prefer actual syllabic boundaries compared to phonetic, and can we actually improve upon these kind of arbitrary decisions. And actually this like I recently read like How Tang's paper on like looking at like different losses and trying to come up with like mathematical foundations. Like and like I really like the paper, and I somehow want to connect those two things, like these kind of our linguistic observations and those kind of things like together, so to speak. And also we want to explore how those phonological vectors are used within inside the models. So like we've observed only that like phonological vectors exist in the representations, right? But we want to even go further on how those phonological vectors are constructed within the models, like using like transformer circuits and stuff. And for example, does the model have like, for example, a format tracker inside it or something like that, such that it can come up with some sort of phonological vectors. So finally, we are also very interested in unifying this understanding to audio representations also, like can we extract orthogonal subspaces in a label-free way, very similar to like Sharon's and all these really good paper on like speaker and phonetic information, orthogonality and stuff like that. And like will such subspaces will be interpretable, like as they've shown on speaker side, but also on acoustic side also. We will like we're like interested in those kind of things too. Like so I think that's it. Thank you for listening, and I'll be open to questions. Thank you.
Thanks.
Mm, 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 mm.
I was thinking for the discussion, maybe
Mhm.
to stop the recording so
Ah,
people
sounds
don't
good. Yeah, sounds good.
they have to ask recording quality questions.
Mm,
But thanks a lot. That was a very impressive and very rich and inspiring set of results. I'm sure
thank
for
you.
questions.
I'll try to share the like slides on. I think I already shared the slides on like Twitter and LinkedIn and
Oh
stuff.
yeah.
So